What's up, JCs and JSets? JC Saves on Ride here, and today we are going to be reacting to North of the Border. Check him out. He does really good, crafts and stuff. He, makes stuff out of
clay. So a couple of weeks ago, I was minding my own business watching the E3 trailers when this happened. And in the words of a great man, I want that.
It's,
Hey folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny, nerdy things. And today I made the Bokoblin Talus from the Breath of the Wild 2 trailer.
Bobby Dugarts.
I was originally going to make the Talus out of clay, but decided against my better judgment to turn this video into sort of an ASMR that makes you want to cut your ears off. I've also got this extra thick foam lying around, and I'm not really sure what to do with it, so I figured why not make it into a big rocky boy. It's about 50 millimeters thick,
I hope you was going to say, hi, I'm Adam, and I make tiny, nerdy
things. Once I've chopped out a big chunky body, I'll carve some meaty fists and some itty-bitty legs, then all I need to do is get close to his spawn point, and he'll naturally form into the shape that I want. And then I'll use a tiny bit of hot glue to hold all his limbs together and a couple of rods of armature wire jammed all up inside his legs to make sure that he doesn't prematurely fall apart. Finally, to finalize the final textures, I'll use a wee rock to carefully cover the entire body in nicks and dents.
Being careful.
Now, there are still a couple gaps that I want to fill, so I'm going to fill all these gaps with gap filler before moving on to the painting. The plan is to paint with mostly washes,
well, he makes tiny, nerdy things.
Gesso?
Gesso.
I don't know, this stuff. It's wonderful because it goes on very thick and it's going to leave all the brush strokes, which will add a tiny bit more texture in. For the aforementioned washes, I'll make a couple of my own specific for this project. To make my wash, I'll add a few drops of black ink, a few drops of brown ink, and a few drops of white ink, before adding some matte medium to give it a little bit of body. Water will help thin it out and help it flow along the cracks, and then it's simple as applying it to the body, taking us from a fabled albino talus to a more recognizable stony color. I'll add a little bit of brown wash to break up the monotony of the gray, but in an effort to keep the cartoony look of the game, I'm not going to add any black washes. Washes are wonderful because they'll flow into any of the cracks and apply shading, providing you, the viewer, with the illusion of competence on my part. Finally, dry brushing in 3 stages with gray, bone white, then white, and we're on to making his base. He's clearly skipped leg day, and with all the added stuff on top, I want to make sure that the base is nice and heavy. To that end, I'm basically going to make a puck out of plaster. Now, it does feel a bit cliche that my first inclination was to make a hockey puck, but this is one of those pretty accurate stereotypes. I was left with the paper from the inside of the tape roll bonded to the plaster, but this worked out pretty well in the end, as it sort of acted as a redneck primer for when I paint the edges black. Now, before I add the grass on top, I want to lay down a layer of dirt, which is a mixture of glue, sand, paint, and grout. Once that's been given ample time to dry, I'm ready to add the static grass on top. So I'll coat the base in a PVA glue and then add a few layers of 3mm summer grass. Then once I brush the residue off the black sides, I'll set it aside and get back to my rocky boy. The Bokoblin platforms are made out of pretty wonky planks, so I made a few cardboard templates, which I will remake using the wonkiest material I own: stir sticks, toothpicks, and kebab skewers. To make the base of the platform, I'll lay down a motley collection of differently sized stir sticks and popsicle sticks, and then I'll chop them down to relatively equal lengths. To make them look a little less perfect, I'll scuff up the edges and the ends until I've got some appropriately monstery-looking planks. Then once I've gone through the same process with the rest of the platforms, I'll start gluing them all together. The strip of tape will hold all the pieces in place, and I'll use a little bit of wood glue on the edges of the piece so that I know they are nice and sturdy.
Wood glue for wood. Big brain boy.
Now, this is a wonky monster platform, so I'm going to need a whole bunch of ugly logs. I only have these perfectly round dowel. With a little bit of anti-TLC, I can chop them down to length and give them a much-needed makeover. Of course, I'm also going to need a bunch of spikes, so I'll give some toothpicks and kebab skewers the old choppy.
Rough hating anti-TLC would be rough
of each of the platforms before jamming a big honking piece of lumber into the side of the talus. Then I can glue the 2 side platforms in place before adding the 3 sections on top.
Big boy!
It's just a case of adding random beams and logs in wherever I felt like. I figured the messier the better here, since I can't imagine the Bokoblins are particularly accomplished engineers.
Goblins?
There are a couple spiky bits hanging off the sides,
Cobblestone
presumably to keep our stalwart adventurer from easily climbing up, which I'll make using a log with spikes glued to it. Now, I know that these are some pretty advanced crafting moves, but if you stick with it, you too will be able to glue stuff to other stuff. Now, at this point, things were going really well, and I was enjoying myself, so I decided to fix that by adding ropes to all of the connection points after the fact. This would have been easy enough to do at the start, but I knew that if I waited until now to do it, I could add that patented Adam self-loathing that goes into all of my models. 3 hours later, it was time to make the luminous stone that would adorn his left shoulder. To make this, I rolled up a lump of black clay into an egg shape and then chopped it down until I had some nice flat surfaces. Then I added a little bit of texture to each of the surfaces before coating the entire thing in a nice glossy varnish. Now, if you haven't got any varnish, you can always give the illusion of glossiness by painting the edges with a thin bead of white paint. With the big stuff finished, it's on to making the accessories. Now, the Bokoblins opted to pimp their ride using rags and bones, the most prominent of these being the big teeth attached to the platforms. I'm not entirely sure what creature these teeth came from since they're so large, but I thought they might be Molduga teeth or possibly harvested from the great skeletons. If you got a better idea, let me know in the comments below. These will get glued into place, and then I can add some ropes to hang my rags and flags off of. The ropes are made out of some woven twine and locked in place using a little bit of thinned out CA glue. I tried a few different methods for making the rags, including, rags, but I didn't have any that I liked the texture of and nothing that hung very well, so I ended up using really thin strips of clay. Obviously, you can't bake the talus since the foam would melt and you'd be left with the Lizalfos base and a rough case of foam smoke pneumonia, so once I'd gotten the clay fabric in place, I simply removed the rope and held it using some soldering hands. Then once I've textured it a little bit and made it look a little bit more raggy, a quick blast with a heat gun will cure the clay and I can reattach it once it's hardened.
Poop.
What if somebody ordered pizza with their mind?
There's another strip of fabric hanging off the platform beside the luminous stone, which I made using a bit more clay with a bit of orange mixed in. And then there's a couple wooden walls on the same side that I made using stir sticks wrapped in twine. These get glued in place, and then I'll add a couple more rags and furs onto the other side. Now, I really like the lighter color of the wood on top, but it blends in a bit too much with the beams and spikes, so I'm going to play a little game I like to call try and paint those really small, hard-to-reach places without accidentally painting all the other bits and pieces. And with the beams repainted, I can add the little blue flags that hang down from the posts. These are all made out of clay as well, and they are ridiculously brittle. Probably over the course of this build, I snapped them off and re-glued them a half dozen times each, and they're more glue now than clay. Then it's time to repaint all my rags, furs, and flags. The idea here is to give the bits hanging off the sides a sort of a furry look, so whites, browns, and beiges blended together, and then the rags hanging off the front of the towels will get the world-renowned Bokoblin artistry painted over top. This is where I get to really showcase my shaky, middle-aged, alcoholic, tremor-induced painting skills, since it's kind of supposed to look bad. Then a quick dry brush just to highlight all the edges, and then I'll glue on a couple more strands of twine across the front of the rags to really make it look like it's just random bits of fabric that they threw up there all willy-nilly. I'll paint the twine on the wooden walls green and then dust everything with a nice white dry brush. Normally I would give all the wood a wash to highlight those gouges and imperfections, but I want to keep that nice bright coloring, so instead I'll use this white dry brush just to highlight all the edges and give it a little bit of nice variation. Then the finishing touches will be adding those little white symbols on the walls. To make the platform that sits on top and houses the horn-blowing boy, I've made another small stir-stick floor and glued 4 posts to it. I've made sure that 2 of the posts sit a little bit lower to account for the variation in platform height, then added the various cross braces. 2 of these braces are made of bone, so I rolled out some bone-white clay and set them in place. I've also painted the posts brown, and I'll attach a skull to each of the corner posts. Then I draped a larger piece of fur over the top before painting it to match what you see in the game. chop some toothpicks into shorter
1
pieces and I'll
million
glue them together
views.
to make an adorable little log ladder. Then both of these can get glued in place, and that's the talus mostly finished. I did decide that the back was a bit bare, so I made another random rag-on rope contraption and attached it to the topmost platform.
Toppermost to the topper.
Lastly, once I've drilled a couple holes in our grassy hockey puck, I can set the talus in place, and that's us basically finished. Of course, what kind of bokoblin-decorated talus camp would be complete without a handful of teeny-tiny pigmen? I found a great 3D model of the bokoblin from the game that's stuck in a T-pose, which is perfect for marking out my armature. When he's finished, this guy should stand about 25 millimeters tall from toe to overcompensatingly long horn tip. I recently picked up some new colored clay, and I wanted to take this opportunity to see how I like sculpting in color. And I gotta say, it's the tits. At least for smaller characters like these, it's really nice to have a solid base color and not have to worry about painting any of the hard-to-reach sections. It also works wonders for hiding imperfections, since one solid color is a lot less likely to show cracks and fingerprints in the same way that painting with a brush would. However, I know that I'm going to want to paint some of the details on top and add a bit of highlight to some of the smaller parts. So a lot of the things that I intend to paint will get sculpted in white, which should be really easy to paint over with whatever color I choose in the end. For instance, the tidy-whitey loincloth will start white and then I can paint it brown later. Once I've got his body finished, I'll bake it once to cure it so that I don't have to worry about disfiguring it while I'm working on the head. His head will be one big ball slopped on top, then I'll pick some eyeballs and a mouth before filling them with eyeballs and teeth. While I make the rest of his face, I'd like to thank the people that keep me fed while I make these videos. So a big thank you to my newest patrons, Dylan Wright, Loopy Mind, Sarah Hennessy, Kim Roger, Morva Lyra, Quirky Perceptions, Charlotte Comrie, Crafty Kiko, and Zarin Gamble. If you like these videos, then please consider subscribing, smash that like button, leave me a comment, and share with your friends, enemies, and everyone in between. Of course, if you aspire to have your praises sung in a YouTube video, then head on over to my Patreon. You can find the link in the description below. Of course, much like our burnt red bokoblin friend, I'm all ears for suggestions, so let me know in the comments below what you'd like to see in the future. We may reach solar death before I get around to making all the ideas I get from you lovely people, but that will not stop me from trying. Now, as far as our friend here is concerned, the only real difference between him and his Breath of the Wild counterparts seem to be that his horn is decidedly larger this time around. I've also finished with the sculpting, and I'm on to painting all the little details. I will paint inside his ears and add the wrist wraps using a bone white. Then I'll use some sepia wash to tint his horn and add some skid marks to his tidy-whities. Then it's just a case of painting all the little bits and pieces that would otherwise be a bit of a pain to sculpt. So I'll get his toenails, I will paint his eyes a nice dark blue, and then highlight them with slightly lighter for the pupils. And then I'll finish off by painting the little necklace chain with a green over top. Now, the highly observant among you may notice that he's holding a wooden club, which is made out of just brown clay. Then once he was finished, I made two more friends for him. One guy holding a horn and another holding a bow. So the only thing left to do will be add them into their appropriate places on the talus. And then we're on to our glamour shots.
I don't really watch the glamour shots.
For those who love peanut butter. And those.
Hi folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things. And a couple of books arrived in the mail a couple days ago that I've been looking forward to cracking open. Over 800 pages of prime grade A Legend of Zelda concept art. How the hell am I going to be able to decide what to make?
Okay, I'm going to go grab some popcorn. I think, did I go down my sleeve? Yes, it did. Oh my god. Okay. Ooh, that's interesting. Yeah?
Well, hello there.
Obi-Wan Kenobi!
As always, I'll start with a chunk of wood, a bit of wire, and see what happens. A Lionel, as it turns out, is made up of three main sections. It's got the legs of a horse, the body of a former Californian governor, and the head of a humanoid lion. I've never made a horse, and I've never made a lion, and I've never made a Californian governor, so this was all a bit of a challenge for me to get the proportions correct. Fortunately, it's all the same business as far as building an armature and then adding clay onto it, so I'm just going to start building things up and go from there. I know that I want the legs to be beefy and short rather than your usual long and lean horse legs because they're going to need to hold up a hilariously ill-proportioned Mr. Olympus. So once I've got the general shape of the legs figured out, I can start adding in the hooves. Now, once I add the hooves in, I realized that that's not how a horse leg works. However, fortunately, I can just remove a section of the lower leg and rebuild it. I'll set the part I removed aside so that I can make some glue later. Then once I'm a bit happier with the shape of the legs, I'll turn to my good friend 99.9% isopropyl alcohol, which I will use to smooth all the fingerprints and bumps out.
Nice.
Now, there's not a great deal of detail on the legs themselves, but the hooves have some adorable little fluffy patches like you might see on a Clydesdale or some type of horse like that. I'm going to assume this means that the Lionels are half Clydesdale as well, which might be why they're a Lionel with a Y instead of a Lionel with an I. To make the fabric that wraps around the legs, I'm just going to cut grooves into it and then add a single piece on top to blend it all in. I tried making it out of the straps wrapped all the way around, but it looked a little bit awkward and the legs are a bit too thick. And then, of course, the last part will be adding his little anklet because
Nah, bruh. That's a
Now, I did underestimate the size of the upper torso once I got into the legs, so I need to bulk it out a bit more with a bit more aluminium, and then I can start adding on to the clay. Building up muscle is a bit daunting at first since it's hard to know where to start, but I find the best way to go about it is by adding exaggerated blobs where the muscle ought to be and going from there. Obviously, the more you know about anatomy, the better, but there are 1,000,000,001 resources online that are perfect for figuring out where everything goes. And once I've got the general shape in place, I'll start blending all the edges until it's one solid piece.
Quintana, McShirley,
Muscles on the front of the torso are built up in the exact same way, with exaggerated blobs slowly getting blended together. You know you've done a good job when you start to feel self-conscious about your own body. Now, the arms will get their own double-strength wound wire since they're going to be holding up a decent amount of weight, and the last thing I want is for them to collapse under the enormous muscles. Now, his big muscular arms need to be ridiculously muscular, so naturally I'm using Arnie in his prime as my muse. And then again, big sections getting blended into smaller sections is the name of the game here.
Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Yet to meet an artist who likes making hands, and I am no exception. Fortunately, our Lionel has the big old clodhopper hands, so a couple of bratwursts squashed into place and blended in will work perfectly. The other hand, though, will be holding a sword, so I'm going to sculpt the fingers around a piece of dowel, which I can then recycle later for the hilt of the sword. Now, his body at this point is a bit too waxy smooth, so I'm going to give him a little bit of horsehair. The easiest way to do this is to take a little bit of bacon bond and apply it with a stiff, bristled brush. Once it cures in the oven, it will be barely noticeable, but you will be able to see some small brush marks, which are perfect for horsehair. Then I'm on to adding the adornments. First will be the tiny little chest piece in the front, which I made out of a strip of polymer clay and a tiny wound bit of armature wire. And then he needs his little belt in the front, as well as a small shoulder thing on the side. Now, before I get any further, I also need to give him his tail. First step is to drill a hole in his butt, and then stick another piece of wire into it. Then once I've shaped it into the shape that I'm after, it's as simple as applying a little bit of clay onto that, and then building up a couple different layers using some little wormy dealies. Then once it's all blended and textured, I can add some simple leather strips to separate the sections. To finish off the rest of his adornment, a couple random pieces of rock or bone fragments get attached to his left arm, and then I can make the random groin protector that hangs down in the front, his heart protector, and the pauldron over his right arm. And then I'm on to making his noggin. Now, did you ever read Animorphs as a kid? If you didn't, they were people that could shapeshift into animals, and while the books themselves sucked, each one had hilarious cover art, like cripplingly bad. They all involved a person transforming into an animal over the course of 5 photos, and even in the early 90s, I knew it was Terabad. But that's pretty much what I'm trying to channel with the Lionel's head. It's not quite a person, and it's not quite a lion. Instead, it's kind of like a stage 3 Animorph. Also, if you ever wonder what a bald Lionel looks like, well, here you go. Now, I'll give him a big, thick neck because I need to lift his head up and forward, and I'm not going to worry about blending it in because the mane's going to cover it all up anyways. Then a quick symmetrical lobotomy, and I can anchor some wire to attach his horns. These will get shaped and textured, and then I'm onto his glorious mane. This will be comprised of a number of thick face sausages working their way around until I've got the bottom layer shaped and textured. I'll also be sure to include his adorable little beard knot before building the rest of his hair up in a series of spiky layers until I'm left with a glorious Goku mane. The only thing more ridiculously sized than a Lionel's body is its weapon. So to make sure the weight of the Honda-sized sword doesn't snap my poor horse legs, I'm gonna dip into the world of LARPing and build a fully foam sword. It's easy enough to shape and sharpen using a good sharp blade, and then a layer of primer in the future will make sure that it isn't too flimsy. I've also made a few more chinks of chain out of armature wire and loosely attached it so that I can paint it before attaching it to the Lionel. I'm also going to make a shield in much the same fashion using predominantly foam to keep the weight down. The concept art I'm using has the fancier, spikier sword and board, but I always preferred the more basic style armaments, so I'm going with that design instead. I assure you that these designs being much easier and quicker to make has no bearing on my decision to use them instead. Finally, we're on to our tiny Hylian hero, and with the Lionel finished, I figured Link would probably stand just under the 54mm scale. With that in mind, I will build him an armature and get his pose sorted out before bulking up the body with a thin layer of clay. As always, I like to get started on the head first so that I can work around those as my proportions. I'm still very much figuring out how to properly sculpt an anime-style face since they're always pretty smooth and soft. My own face is very much a wrinkly mess of smile lines and baggy eyes, and as a general rule, you'll always be more comfortable sculpting what you know. The last thing is a handsome, youthful, 100-year-old warrior with nary a scar and a complexion that the Kardashians would kill for, so it's always a challenge for me, despite how often I seem to make him. At any rate, once I've got that baby-smooth face finished, I'll start working my way inward from his extremities, starting with the feet and the legs, and then the hands and the arms. Much the same as I did for the Lionel, I'm going to give Link a sword pommel to hold on to so that I can sculpt his closed fist first. The easiest way to do this is to attach a piece of armature wire to the base, and then bend it into the position I want before adding the hand over top.
Then you remove it.
At this point, I've given Link a full body bake, and I'm ready to add his fancy outfit. The original design calls for his thin blue champion's tunic, so I started with that in mind. However, the last time I made a Breath of the Wild Link, I gave him this exact outfit, and I didn't just want to make the same thing over again, so I'm going to take this opportunity to give him my favorite set in the game, the Hylian armor. The only problem with this is that I had semi-committed to the champion's tunic, and he's a bit thicker than I had originally planned. Whatever, we'll just say that he's a post-meal Link, and he's got a slight problem with salt retention.
Salt?
However, this time at least I remember to give him a Sheikah slate, and beyond that, it's just a case of adding lots of belts, buckles, straps, and little pieces of armor.
Cowboy. Yeah, there he is. There he is.
Ugly, stupid
Belts,
TikTok.
buckles, straps,
Piss
and
off.
little pieces of armor.
Cough, cough, you're now infected with the cold.
And then the finishing touches are to take our balding hero and give him a noodly toupee. More specifically, giving him his own flowing mane by way of wormy-deely, squished and textured into beautiful blonde locks synonymous with our silent protagonist. To make his sword, scabbard, and shield, I'll bake some small pieces of clay into roughly the shape I'm after. Then with just a touch of sanding, we've got his weapons ready.
The great sword of these nuts.
And with that, we're finally on to the painting. Now, I'm going to go with a golden Lionel for this project, and I kind of leaned a bit heavy onto the gold to start off with. However, I figured if it's a yellowish-brown coat I'm after, then a bright yellow base coat is at least a good color to start with. Fortunately, my second coat was decidedly less vomit-inducing. And then with that bottom base coat done, I'm ready to start painting all the Lionel zebra lines. And yes, I said zebra instead of zebra, and no, I won't go back to zebra, because zebra just makes more sense. I tried to match the lines that you see on the Lionels in-game, but I can't say with 100% certainty that it's a direct one-to-one match. I can, however, say with 100% certainty
zebra,
that it is
'cause
not
I'm
a
American.
one-to-one match, so at least that's something.
But I'm also British, so I might
I gave his
say
hair a nice
zebra.
base coat of off-white,
I
actually I think it's
zebra
bone white,
too.
and I made sure to get all the various tufts of fur on his arms, as well as his tail the same color. Then a heavy dry brushing of white over the tips add a tiny bit of Maybelline shine to the entire thing.
Maybelline,
The various
New York.
straps on his body, tail, and his beard will get painted with a dark leathery brown, and then the various pieces of armor will get covered in a warm gray. Then it's on to adding highlights to all the pieces. I'll do this by adding a little bit of color to all the edges before dry brushing a brighter color over top. This step is really important for helping the sections look a little bit more natural, and by using a slightly larger brush, it helps to maintain that cel-shaded style one might recognize from the Breath of the Wild. His eyes got painted with a dark blue, and then I added a little bit of lighter blue around the edges to try and simulate the spooky glow from the concept art. Finally, it's on to adding the black wash over the top of the rivets, the buckles, and into all the nooks and crannies. Then once that has dried, I'll go over everything with a final dry brushing of an almost white off-white, and this will really highlight all those edges and make everything stand out a tiny bit. Finally, his sword and shield get basically the same treatment, and we're on to Link. Link will undergo very much the same process as the Lionel, on a smaller and inversely frustrating scale. However, while I paint our Elfine hero in the background, I'd like to thank today's sponsor, you. More specifically, I want to thank my newest patrons, Golwar, J. Kyle Fagan, Sarah Forbes, Miss Deci, Boodle Oodlin, Courtney West, Theo Dawkins, Michael Perillo, Lawrence Girard, Marilise, and Athena Wood. While these nerdy things I make are indeed tiny, the time and effort it takes to make them every week is anything but, and it simply wouldn't be possible without your support. So if you like these videos and you want to see me make more of these silly little things, consider subscribing, liking this video, commenting, and sharing. Of course, if you want to go above and beyond and help feed me while I make these things, then you can head on over to my Patreon page. The link is in the description below. However, this Link is still here, and you may be asking yourself, why is this Link blue if he's wearing the Hylian armor? Well, I really like the blue in the Breath of the Wild versus the standard Link green, so I decided to keep that color going. Besides, you can always dye the arm in the game, and you pretty much end up here anyways. But at this point, we have attached the blade to the hilt, equipped our hero with a shield, and slapped his scabbard onto his back, so our Link is finished. Which is the only thing left to do is build the base. Now, we did want our ill-fated foes to be meeting in a grassy field, but a grassy field's a little bit boring, so I'm going to really spice things up by adding some rocks. Nothing screams, I like to live life on the edge, quite like geology, am I right? So I'll hack and chop some foam into vaguely rocky shapes, and then glue them haphazardly onto my pizza base.
I
Now, even though I'm going to be covering
joke.
the entire base in grass, it's a tad bit too flat. And I want to give it a little bit of variation, so much like me in an awkward situation, it's getting plastered. Once the plaster is dried, I'll prime the foam gray before giving it a bit of color by way of washes. I'll start with a black wash before working my way through gray, and then brown before finally adding a little bit of ochre. When that is dried, I'll tickle the tips with a light dusting of light gray and white. Then the entire base gets painted over with a dirty dirt brown, and I'm ready to get this flocking show on the road. I'm going to add the grass in a few layers, starting with a very thick carpet of 3mm. This will act as the base, and if I apply it on thick enough, you shouldn't really be able to see the brown underneath at all. I'll follow the 3mm with a bright 6mm, then use my fingers to scrunch it up a little bit. This will give it a bit more of a realistic look and prevent the grass from looking too uniform. Then another layer of 6mm before adding some final highlights with a much lighter 3mm. I've intentionally left a few spots beside the rock uncovered so that I can add a little bit of dirt and debris. I'll fill this section in with a little bit of fine-grained sand and then some slightly larger grit before adding some tiny rocks and a bit of green foam. A final spritz of iceberg alcohol and a few gallons of thinned-out scenic cement will hold it all in place.
Stupid.
Then the only thing left to do is add our pieces onto the base, and we're set.
Star Wars. Cool. Shiny. Mega board.
Still E-Fresh Refresh, and now Subway's refreshing their classics, like the sweet onion teriyaki sauce topped on.
Hi folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things. And I've been pretty busy moving this week, so I haven't had a lot of time to do a big project, so I thought I'd make another Pokemon card. And this is what I came up with. So sorry.
Yay!
So far I've made a grass type, fire type, a water type, a psychic type, and a ghost type, so it makes sense to make a ground type, and what better choice than Diglett? Of course, making a hot dog with eyeballs would realistically take about 10 minutes, and it would be a tad bit boring. Plus, I need to figure out a way to stretch this video to 10 minutes long to reap that sweet, sweet ad revenue. A little while ago, I remember seeing this picture of Bathtub Trio floating around, and I thought, hey, now there's a terrible idea. Of course, this means that I need to make a super buff dude with a hot dog for a head. So I went on Google and found the buffest dude I could find and used that as a guide for my armature, which I then bulked out with aluminium and covered in a thin layer of cosplay. Basically, my buff dude will be the base for the card, which he'll be holding up, and his Diglett head will be chest bursting out the top of it. Then it's time to pack on some muscle. Now I've baked the first layer of cosplay already, which will give me a nice firm base to build on top of, and the subsequent layers of Super Sculpey will get attached using a thin coating of Bacon Bond. I'll add the largest muscle groups individually so that I can get a decent approximation of where each of the muscles will sit, and then I'll blend it all together until I've got a rough outline. I like to start with the legs and work my way up, since I have a tendency to make huge upper bodies with itty-bitty legs if I'm not paying attention. I don't know why though, maybe it's because I haven't done leg day in 12 years and I have a body type similar to a chicken, so I have a tendency to sculpt what I recognize. Otherwise, once the legs are done, I can start adding the rest of the muscles of the upper body. Now, same as before, I'll start with the large bulbous shapes before blending them all together. Once I've got my body as thick as I want, I can start refining some of the muscles by carving away the excess clay. It's kind of my preferred method, since I find that I have a lot more control when removing material, and I'm less likely to deform what's already in place. Generally, when you're adding clay, you have to press it into place, and it's easy to smoosh your already lovingly crafted model, but when you're removing clay, you can approach it with a much softer touch. Besides, this ain't marble, so if you take too much off, just add it back in. Ridiculously beefy dude is jacked up on horse steroids and HGH, I can smooth everything out with a heavy dosing of alcohol. Alcohol will help soften the top layer, and by using a soft brush, I can blend a lot of the sharper edges and seams into one another, which should leave me with a disturbingly smooth, headless, handless Mr. Olympia. And I'm ready to add the head, and as far as sculpting heads goes, this is probably one of my favorites. Basically, you make a hot dog, cut it in half, and then attach it to the body. Now, pay attention close here because this is where it gets pretty complicated. His nose is a little smooshed ball of clay, and his eyes are even smaller, smoosheder balls of clay. Now, I did have to reattach his nose because it was a little too low, but once it was put in place, that's it. That's his whole head. That is Diglett's head. Now, of course, I still managed to cock it up once it was been baked, and I decided that I wanted the head as a separate part that will be attached on top of the card instead of bursting through it. Fortunately, a quick beheading will leave me with a lovely flat top to work off of. The guard will be resting on the flat neck stub, but I want his hands to be holding up the edges, so I need to make a couple little hands. Now, before I can add any detail to the hands, I need a card. This time I made my cards slightly larger. They come in at about 3.5 inches instead of the standard 3, but this will help fit the body a little bit better. The general design is going to be the exact same though, with a few of the pieces glued together to thicken it up, and then the little details added on top to give a bit of dimension. Then I can use the card to angle the fingers so it looks like a horrifying version of Atlas holding up the world. Once I'm happy with the finger location, I can remove the card and start adding some of the detail onto the fingers.
And then, mate, you got to bake it.
Finally, to really highlight the buffness of my Diglett and to hit my tiny wormy dealy quota for the day, I'll add some strategically placed veins.
Buff, mate.
Then the final piece of this weird puzzle is adding Diglett's bright red man panties. I feel like this is an integral part of the whole piece and really ties it together. Also, as an internet sculptor, I don't really get a lot of opportunities to say banana hammock out loud, so I'm damn well gonna say it now. Banana hammock. Banana hammock. Banana hammock. Now I added a little bit of height to Diglett's head since I wanted it to be a little bit taller, and then I stuck a whole bunch of little balls to the base, which will act as my tiny rocks. Now I suppose I could have used tiny rocks for this, but I didn't. Instead, I decided to make tiny balls of clay that look like little rocks. Then it's time to get painting, so I'll start by priming my body and head with a beige undercoat. Now, my first attempt at painting was to use some dark brown contrast paint, but about halfway through, I decided that I didn't like it and I rubbed it off. Instead, I painted the entire body with a nice brown earth, since I figured Diglett's a ground-type Pokemon, and what's more ground-type than earth brown? And to add some highlights, I aggressively dry brushed the entire model with lighter shades of brown until I had a bit of a lazy man shading. Now I try to avoid adding too much shading on the Pokemon models since I like the vibrant individual colors of the Pokemon art style, but I also think we veered a tiny bit away from that with the inclusion of a super jacked man in a Speedo. His nails get painted with a light beige, and that aforementioned Speedo gets a bright, vibrant red that I think really draws the unwilling eye towards it. And then his nose gets painted pink, and his eyes are simple black ovals with little white pupils. Finally, I can paint those little clay rocks gray and then hit them with a light dry brush to really highlight all the edges. Then I'll come back later with a little black wash just to add a last touch of shade. Otherwise, the only thing left to do is glue my card to my neck stump and then glue my head onto the card, making sure that the head is lined up with the neck. But with that, I'd say we are on to the glamour shots.
That boy got a neck. What is that? Okay. Oh.
Come on, Reese's. Did you really wake up looking like this? Smoke.
Last video,
Hi
guys.
folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and Red Dead Redemption's Undead Nightmare was straight up one of my favorite games of all time. And while I wait impatiently for Rockstar to give me zombie Arthur Morgan, I figured I'd just make my own. I don't trust my ability to wing horse anatomy, so I printed out a skeleton horse on which I will trace my armature outline. I also don't want you to pay too much attention to the size difference between the man and the horse, as about halfway through I'm going to decide that I like the Arabian horse more than a thoroughbred, so I'll end up making Arthur slightly larger than this paper shows. Now this was my plan all along, and it was definitely intentional, and was by no means an accident, so shut up, you're not my mom. Now with my arms and spine sorted out, I can start putting it all together on a sculpting block. So I've drilled the holes just large enough that I should be able to get a pretty good friction fit, but I can still take them out if I need to fix anything. Like, for instance, if the very first time I attach legs, realize I've got them backwards. A couple dabs of super glue will hold my spine in place long enough to get some thin wire wrapped around the joints, and then I'll also reinforce them with a little epoxy putty before it's time to start bulking the body up.
Cool. Ooh.
Normally I'd be all about saving money on clay by bulking the majority of the body out
Super
using aluminium foil, but this is going to be a zombie horse, so I want to leave
Oh
lots
my
of room for
gosh.
carving out sections
I
of the main
can't
body
speak
so that I can have some
today.
ribs and guts and other inside things on the outside. Plus, this way it ends up weighing a lot more, and as we all know, when something's heavy, it's much higher quality. So even if the end result sucks, it'll still be ridiculously fancy since it weighs several kilos. At any rate, at this point, I've got the general shape of the body sorted out, and I can start adding in the muscular detail.
Tail. Oh.
Now, I name all my horses and games Steven with a PH regardless of sex because I think animals with people names is just about the funniest thing in the world. So instead of saying this horse, I'm going to be calling him Steven from now on. Now, speaking of Steven, it's time to cut his head off. I've made sure the proportions are correct while the head was attached, but it is a lot easier to add all the details without having to
Firework.
the entire body. Now, I want to start with a fully shaped head so that I only need to really remove material to get to an appropriately sized skull, since horse skulls are on par with the rest of their bodies in that they are super weird and they creep me out. Horse teeth, in particular, are the stuff of nightmares.
Yes.
Of course, Steven is a zombie horse, not a skeleton horse, so I'll make sure to cover the majority of the skull in some well-used skin. Then I can reattach his head, close the gap, and start hacking into his body.
Cool. You just decapitated and recapitated a horse. I don't know if that made sense. It did to me. Recapitated is the opposite of decapitated. It's the opposite of
And once I'm happy with
decapitated.
how unhappy Steven makes me, I'll go over the entire body with a healthy dose of isopropyl alcohol. This will help soften the top surface and blend in a lot of the scratches and seams that I don't want, as well as get rid of a lot of the fingerprints. Then it's into the oven for the first bake. The problem with using so much clay is that little pockets form underneath, and when the air heats up, it needs to escape, and you're left with these little cracks. Fortunately, they're pretty easy to fix by filling in the gaps with a bit more clay. Then I can get on to adding the little bits of viscera and slimy, nasty parts that will connect the ribs and any of the bones and the muscles. I'll usually use cause clay for this step since it's quite a bit stickier, and once it's baked, these little pieces are much less likely to fall off. I'll also add ears at this point since his bald, earless head is giving me an ulcer. And it's time to cover all that detail up with a saddle. I probably could have done a little bit more planning ahead to avoid doing all that work on something no one will ever see, but if you came to this channel expecting a plan, you're gonna be disappointed. After all, planning ahead is like studying, and studying is for nerds. I prefer to wing it and see what happens. That's why it took me 8 years to get a 4-year degree and then decide I'd rather make cringy videos on YouTube full of outdated memes. And once I finish the saddle, it's time to add all the little details like straps, buckles, and all the little bits and bobs that draw the eye away from the anatomical mistakes I've made. Finally, with my harness and bridle finished, a whole bunch of tiny wormy dealies will work as Steven's mane, and a long wormy dealie will be his tail. Now, I know that zombie Arthur Morgan probably isn't going to be sleeping, but I wanted to make a bedroll, and 2021's been a rough year, so I treated myself. Otherwise, Steven's finished, and it's time to get started on zombie Arthur. So this will be the exact same process as making the horse armature, except it's a person. So, more arms and fewer legs. We'll also use Steven's saddle to give Arthur's skeleton an appropriate riding stance, then it's on to the old clay-on-wire adventure we all know and love.
Film the what?
Person. So, more arms and fewer legs. We'll also use Steven's saddle to give Arthur's skeleton an appropriate riding stance, then it's on to the old clay-on-wire adventure we all know and love.
You knob. Oh. What knob?
Now, making folds and pins is as simple as adding tiny wormy deedlies and blending them in. I find a good reference is to put on my favorite pair of assless chaps and then slide forward in my chair, which causes them to bunch up in a way similar to how they would look when you're riding a horse. Now, if you are going to be using assless chaps, I do recommend wearing some kind of underwear just to prevent fabric-related friction burn on your undercarriage. Otherwise, a quick coat of alcohol will soften the edges and I can start adding the dirty detail in.
Oh.
I've added a belt and some spurs, and then I'll toss it in the oven to cure it before getting started on the upper body. This follows basically the same process as the pants, where you get the base layer down, then add wormy deedlies until it looks like a bunched up shirt.
Ooh, a bunched up shirt?
Like everything else, I want to get the completed shape of the outfit first, and then I'll come back with my knife and add the rips and tears afterwards. This gives me a good idea of where things will sit, and it also plays into my inability to plan ahead. Speaking of ahead, let's make one. So while looking for good zombie inspiration, I came across this picture by XCNs on Reddit. Now my first thought on seeing this was, oh damn, they're actually making Undead Nightmares 2, before realizing it's just dope-ass fan art. Then my second thought was, hey, I don't actually have any artistic talent, I just copy what other people do, so why not bring this dope-ass fan art into the third dimension? So I'll start by making a spooky little skull and then building everything on top of that. As I so often do, I got a little carried away while making my skull, and I ended up adding a lot more detail than I needed to, given that most of it's going to be covered up anyways. And it's into the oven to cure it, and I can start building outwards. Top tip here, if you're not particularly good at portrait sculpting, make a zombie instead. This way you can hide a lot of the glaring issues behind gaping wounds and broken limbs. For instance, I was having trouble getting Arthur's nose right, so I just, didn't add it in. Now, anytime I play a game, I basically make myself, which is pretty easy to do because I'm a white dude with long hair and a beard, and game developers still seem to think that only white dudes play games, so the vast majority of protagonists are white dudes with beards. Now, all this to say, I gave Arthur a beard. Otherwise, once I've got his hair in place, I'll give him a quick scalping so that I have a nice flat surface to add his hat. A zombie would be carrying a 6-shooter, but I had these perfectly sized brass tubes lying around, so I figured, why the hell not? Maybe Arthur's retained a shred of his humanity and stalks the wasteland hunting the undead remains of his former posse, or maybe I just wasn't sure what to do with his hands.
I'm not sure what to do with my hands.
At any rate, with the majority of the body finished, I can start adding all the little details in, like his gun belt, his Indiana Jones satchel, and the various belts and straps. I also figured a shirt was a little too pristine given the whole zombie thing, so I ripped up his right sleeve and added some metal damage to his forearms. Then I can do a quick check to make sure he still fits on a Steven and appreciate the size difference between Arthur and his Arabian steed. So Arthur is 6'1" and an Arab stands around 5 foot at the shoulder, so this is okay, just like I planned all along. Then the only thing left to do is add Arthur's left hand on the saddle horn and give him his patented black bandana. Then we're finally finished with the sculpting and it's time to get painting. I'll start with a nice black primer, followed by a white zenithal highlight. A zenithal highlight helps to show where the light would fall on a subject if the sun was directly overhead, and it helps with shading as you build up the layers. And it also makes it look like a statue covered in pigeon shit. Brown's going to be a recurring theme here, since Steven is a dark brown and there's a lot of leather, but I tried to mix up the shades so they don't all blend together. Dirty brown washes will help make everything look a little bit more weathered and worn, and a nice bright blood red base coat will really highlight all the gnarly damage. And then the bone sections all get painted with a bone. his eyeball gets the old zombie cataract white, and I can finish him off by painting the middle parts with a bit of silver. Arthur's a bit more fun because he's a bit more colorful. I'll start by base coating his blue shirt blue and his brown pants brown, and his boots and his hat get a thin layer of black. I started by giving his skin a pale, jaundicey yellow, but decided to go all in on the zombie green. It's a bit more fantastical, but it's a zombie cowboy riding a zombie horse, so I think we left historical accuracy behind about 10 minutes ago. Otherwise, it's the usual bone white for the bone, blood red for the blood, and leather brown for the various leathers. And of course black for his bandana, and I gotta give him those spooky white eyeballs. Now I realized at this point that his blue shirt is a bit too blue, and given the state of everything else, I need to tone it down. I don't want to repaint everything, so I've mixed up a bit of white ink and matte medium so I can apply a thin layer of whitewash over the blue. Once it dries, it should hopefully look a little bit more worn down. Highlighting the frayed edges with brighter white helps, and then I'll basically dry brush the entire model with a light brown highlight. This makes all the sharp edges really pop and gives everything a great weathered and worn look. Then I'll add some blood stains by applying thick globs of red wash and letting it dry in little pools. This has the tendency to stain the edges darker and makes for easy but great looking stains. Finally, I'll cover all the bloody sections with a high gloss varnish. That means the painting is done and it's time to make a base. I'll use Steven to mark out the size I need for my base. Then I can whip out some plaster to give it some texture. And once it's dried, I'll paint the base brown. I'm going to be covering it in grout, but it's not a bad idea to paint anyways in case some of the bottom shows through. My grout's an off-white, and I want this to be a reddish-brown color, so I'm going to use some of my pigment powders to get the color I want. Then I can coat the base in a thick layer of PVA glue and sprinkle the grout liberally over the top. Some little rocks and stones will add a bit of color and size variation, and then I can activate the grout by spraying it with water. It wasn't quite as red as I had wanted, so I dusted the top with a bit more red pigment, but once it's dried it should be rock hard and ready for grass. This is static grass, and it's the tits. And this is a static grass applicator, and it is also the tits. Basically, it charges the static grass with enough static to help it stand on end, so all you need to do is put a layer of glue on the base wherever you want the grass to grow, and then let the applicator do the work for you. Of course, it's worth making sure that your battery isn't dead when you add the grass, since that's a pretty important part of the process. And once you put new batteries in the applicator, cleaned up the non-static grass, and reapplied your glue, you're good to go again. I like to build up my grass in layers, adding a bit of glue over the tips of the previous layer to help add some variation in the height. I would have liked to add a little bit of tufts of longer grasses, but I don't actually have any longer bits, and I didn't want to cut up my paintbrushes just for the sake of some dead grass, so I'll make do with these little dead bushes. Finally, I'll add a bit of light green flock because I like it, then I can stick Arthur and Steven in place. Last but not least, I'll take a bit of my mixed up reddish grout and strategically dust the entire model to give the whole thing a nice dusty appearance and help tie it into the base.
Oh my
God. I think we're on to the glamour shots.
Whoa. Okay, well, we'll go watch the glamour shots, and then that's going to be it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed. Please like and subscribe, but only if you want to. But please do it. It helps. Yeah. Anyway.
There you have it, folks. I hope you like this one, because it's been sitting on my to-do list for ages now, and I'm chuffed tibbits with how it turned out. So let me know down below what you think and what you'd like to see next. I'm thinking something Elden Ringy.
Shut up, Adam. Okay, I hope you enjoyed. Yeah, thank you for watching, and I will see you all in the next video. See ya!